Welcome to the Regeneration Collective podcast, the next UN Visions for a Regenerative Future. I'm Silke von Brockhausen, a UN insider with 18 years across more than a dozen UN missions and founder of the Regeneration Collective. As the UN approaches its 80th year and the campaign for the next Secretary General gets underway amid protracted conflicts, widening inequalities, and crossed planetary boundaries, we ask, how can the UN become the platform through which people, institutions, and the more than human world repair and transform broken systems and create conditions where life can thrive? In each episode, we speak with regenerative practitioners, policy shapers, indigenous knowledge holders, peace builders, culture makers, and frontline humanitarians about the lived experiences and visions that could translate into regenerative UN policies, organizational culture, and operations. This is for UN staff, partners, member states, and bridge builders who are curious about what regeneration means in practice and who are ready to turn the UN into a trailblazer for this shift. And I'm deeply honored to welcome to the podcast my friend and longtime UN colleague, Laurel Patterson, Head of Strategic Partnerships and Communications with UNDP's Crisis Bureau. Laurel has been one of the most courageous and visionary leaders I've known inside the UN system, someone who embodies what I call regenerative leadership, leading with heart, courage, and innate wisdom in the midst of complexity and hierarchy. As former director of the SDG integration portfolio at UNDP, Laurel spearheaded innovative projects to accelerate the 2030 agenda across more than 130 countries. She has also been a driving force behind the Transformative Spaces initiative, a collective effort to create safe and inclusive spaces across the UN where colleagues can connect, co-create, and explore new ways of being and working together. Beyond her impressive policy and leadership roles, Laurel has been a role model of what a new kind of leadership inside the UN can look like. One rooted in awareness, deep listening, and the belief that systems transformation begins with inner transformation. So welcome to the podcast, Laurel.
Thank you, Silke.
Good to have you here. And I'm starting with a question I'm asking all of my podcast guests. What does the word regeneration mean to you, and why is it especially relevant for the UN at this moment in time?
Thank you, Silke. And I'm so happy to be here. To me, what drew me into this work in this space was the question, why do we keep creating results and outcomes that nobody wants? Why do we do this? Why do we feel individually? Why do we see the world sort of so clearly with such clarity, and yet collectively the results that we achieve aren't the ones that we want? And I was really inspired by Otto Schormer, a colleague that you and I both share in common, but as well as practitioners like Gabor Mate. And what he described was that over time, we are so adaptive as human beings that we see the world through all of these cracks and fragments, and we believe that they're true, as opposed to really recognizing and seeing that what we're seeing is not as it might be, but it's through a fractured lens. So it's a long way of saying, for me, when it comes back to regeneration, and as you mentioned, it starts with ourselves. We don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And if we are looking through this cracked and fractured lens, we can't identify the opportunities that would create positive momentum. And to me, regeneration is an important term in the sense that we aren't looking fundamentally to fix what's broken. We are looking to transcend. We are looking to create beyond what's possible, beyond the things that we see in front of us. But we're working, obviously, we're rooted and grounded in the realities that we've experienced. So that to me is this kind of tension in the term, is that we can only build from where we are, but that can only transcend if we realize that so much of the work needs to be with us and reconnecting some of these fractures inside ourselves and also what we're seeing around us.
I fully agree with you. And this is what I feel this awareness is so fundamental to starting also to change our environments. Once we see it differently, we can also maybe see the cracks where we need to change our behavior, our organizational culture. And I would like to hear From you, what do you think could this kind of regenerative leadership approach look like in the UN?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so one of the initiatives that we started in the early days of COVID was around awareness-based collective action. One of the things that I always found valuable about this work, it can be a little theoretical, that appeals to some people, lots of people it doesn't feel practical, um, it doesn't feel pragmatic. And what we found is when we started framing this and inviting people into spaces for awareness-based collective action, that resonated a lot more with colleagues who were saying, I want to re-engage in the mission of the UN. I want to rediscover my purpose. Why did I start this in the first place? I've forgotten over time. Sort of, you blur into the bureaucracy and you can forget some of these things. There was a whole group of colleagues that wanted to lead that process. But fundamentally, that's one that has to start with a sense of ourselves. And when we brought people into those spaces in the early days of COVID, it helped, I think, that we had this massive shock of everyone being at home. For many of us in the UN, it's so much of our identity and our time, frankly, is tied up in being at work and with work and consumed by work, et cetera, right? So the experience of trying to adjust to a life at home, people are looking around perhaps in a way they hadn't more recently. What is this life of mine? And how did I arrive at this point? So to me, that was a self-selecting process. We opened it up to anybody in the UN system that wanted to come across this journey. We anchored it in theory U, with the point being that first we need to drop into ourselves. We need to understand our own echo chambers. We need to understand our own stories. And as we drop to the bottom of the U, we get into this beautiful space of letting go and letting come. What do I need to learn? What do I need to unlearn? That part is something I would say we're not as strong at the UN. We're always saying yes and more and learn, but unlearn, that's a different process. And then creating this space for what's new or what's possible to emerge. That was our process together. We opened it to anybody, everybody. We really benefited from having Akim Steiner, who was at the time the head of UNDP, join a lot of the sessions. Often we didn't have these on his calendar, and it created, I think, for people, in what is a relatively hierarchical system, a sense that this was okay. This was a legitimate pursuit for staff and colleagues. And so I saw many people step into that potential, their leadership potential, in a different way than they had been able to before, with the permission, since that's a word that came up a lot, the permission to reconnect with their whole selves, with their sense of being, their sense of purpose, their sense of humanity, their sense of vulnerability, all of the scars and fractures, as well as all those successes that brought them there. For me, that was the fundamental of integration and the work that I was doing at the time. It wasn't like, when we started integration, it was like, how do we get the data? How do we get the innovation? How do we get the knowledge? How do we get the pieces? But that's not it. The thing that changed was that reintegration or connection with ourselves. That's what was missing. It wasn't a clever way to combine, quantitative and qualitative data. It's not. Is that much more fundamental space. So I watched leaders across the UN pick this up in different ways. We tried to sustain it and build it. You mentioned transformative spaces in the beginning, but I think the key for this to be something more broadly sustained in the UN system is that it needs to be authentic. It needs a language that makes sense to different people and different cultures. And that, I think, is the process right now of people being able to describe this type of leadership in their own terms. You want to say compassion, fine. You don't. But what does it feel like for you? And I think broadening out that vocabulary, broadening out those actions, what does it really look like? Authentic to me, authentic to you. We opened up a whole space of conversation where people in different parts of the world were saying, there's nothing new here. These are traditions that are built in our culture over centuries. Maybe some cultures are discovering it now, but others of us have always had this, and here's how we talk about it. So to me, the key for this to be really tapped for the potential for the UN it has to be authentically owned by that multicultural, multinational, multi-generational leadership that we have. It is not Laurel or Silke's version of what this is or could be. That's the key. It has to be jointly held and owned.
Yeah, I love this. And also realizing how much the pandemic actually started to open up this kind of spaces across the UN. I was working for UNICEF back then, and there were also a lot of mental wellness initiatives and much deeper look at what it means to lead in this day and age. And much more about building trust and relationships while we are not able to see each other. And the transformative spaces came after the SDG Leadership Labs and other initiatives. Can you tell us more about Otto Scharmer's theory or his involvement in the UN and how you think we can actually manage to scale this kind of initiatives beyond? I mean, obviously they need to make sense and they need to be adaptable for the different worldviews of our colleagues, but what other things can we do to scale these kind of initiatives more?
Right. So from those early days of global dialogues, which is what we called it on awareness-based collective action, we created a series of deep dives for colleagues that on a more limited basis that wanted to go in depth into some of the concepts and ideas. That was the next thing that we did after the dialogues. Again, without advertising it much, sending out the emails, we had 800 staff all over the place right back and want to be part of this, apply for it. And I'm always reminded that the strongest resonance that we got from the field were colleagues that were working in crisis, conflict, and other hardship stations. And that made a lot of sense to me, having come from 8 or 9 years in Somalia, because you know what doesn't work. You feel it and you see it. And there's so many colleagues that are in those contexts ready to take a risk, ready to do something different, especially when you're working and living far away from your family. It's easy to feel uprooted. So those were the first people that came in. And that was also our strongest feedback from colleagues in two ways. One, in terms of saying, I want to say this in my own words. This is not a Western thought. It didn't emerge there, and it's not like we're hearing it for the first time because you all in New York brought it up, right? So it gave people an opportunity, and we spent a lot of time ensuring that we were adapting the way that we brought Theory U into spaces so that it could be co-led by people in the regions or in countries themselves. It could be adapted and connected with the other factors that colleagues also felt was really going to be important for them in taking the work for it. And very important among that was understanding power dynamics. Connects to the second big piece of feedback that we got, is that many people said, I love being in these spaces. I've loved connecting with my colleagues. I've loved putting these big ideas together that we're collectively working on, learning, right, creating, being in relation with each other in different ways. But when I turn off this screen and open up my office door, wow, right? That's a different world. And it's 10 feet from where I'm sitting right now. And that gap was really, really big for colleagues. And it was very difficult for them to figure out, how do I take something that I believe and understand and I'm part of this and connect it with the rest of the UN work that I do or the partners that I work with. It was too far away. And so that's where we brought in sort of related perspectives. Indigenous leaders came in and talked to us about their experience negotiating the 2030 agenda. For example, what did that look and feel like? Things we really had not fully considered and brought into our spaces directly, but also understanding power. Because if you don't understand power, and if you can't see yourself in that system, which is a certain power paradigm, you can't act effectively within it. You cannot, right? So how do you bring in voices from more of the periphery? What does it look like to do that? How to do that intelligently? How to invite into spaces in a way that genuinely creates equality in the conversation and doesn't do what we normally do. I'm most senior, I speak first, then it's you. We have one person from civil society. They've been in every meeting that we've had for the last decade. How to break out of that is actually, it's a lot of different skills. that you can learn, right? But they don't all come from Theory U. So we felt that Theory U opened the door, and then we really had to move quickly. We created something called a field guide to generative dialogues, because that's exactly what we were trying to do, is make it more accessible, not make it feel like one idea dominates what people need to know, or what they already know in their leadership styles, and sort of give toolkits, give suggestions, ways to consider how might we. So that was really important. We've done that in different leadership fora now for UNDP. Our last convening was with all of the leaders who participated in UN 2.0. And I was mentioning to you, Silke, that for many of those leaders who were involved in that, they didn't know each other. And again, this is the relationships are so important, the time for that. If we don't know each other, you could say that transformation moves at the speed of trust, which I think is true. Because I take a risk on you, you take a risk on me. I need to believe what you say. If I'm in a bind and I need confidential or sensitive feedback or advice, we have to trust each other. We have to know that we're on the same page. And so much of our systems pull us in exactly the opposite direction. So those were the kinds of things that we confronted, but I'm happy that Otto is actually bringing together all of the UN colleagues, as you mentioned, SDG Leadership Labs, through the work that I've been talking about. Everyone has been part of this in different ways for a special set of sessions that will start this fall. And the focus, as much as it's on awareness-based systems leadership, it's on the relational. How do we know each other? How do we work together? How do we transcend, these kind of self-imposed, but frankly, very tall walls that we're busy building to separate ourselves, right, to what we consider to be limiting risk at this point, when in fact it's doing just the opposite. So I'm really excited that that is coming through from Otto for a whole number of UN staff next.
That's amazing news. I'm so happy to see that the seeds, they're growing. I've been in Syria last year and Afghanistan, and people were talking about these SDG leadership labs in the UN country teams. I feel like it requires this demand from staff, and I feel like the staff is really ready to engage in a different way around their work. And then I feel also it's necessary to have leaders like Achim Steiner to then support this but through his presence. And I have one question I ask all of my podcast guests is to imagine they're the Secretary General or have a direct advisory role in her office, the one that is going to start on the 1st of January 2027. What would you advise this Secretary General how to create this organizational culture throughout the whole organization? Any ideas that you have from your background?
Thanks, Silke. I mean, for one thing, it's a willingness to take risk. So I didn't fully realize, if I can say it that way, the risk that I was taking when I started this work until people started saying to me, "Wow, you're very brave." And I thought, am I doing something wrong, or what is the risk here that required bravery that I wasn't necessarily seeing? But the reality is that convening spaces that are so different, that start in grounding, that focus on reconnection, that give you a chance to sit with yourself for 1 minute of your day, right? And then see how that feels. It might not feel great. It might. Whatever it happens to be, to sit with it as part of doing your job, as part of being as effective as we can, and the privilege that we have to work at the UN and take forward the mandate. I mean, these were things that were for some people controversial. And so I remember one person, of course, those early days of Zoom when we were doing some of the global dialogues, but they were accidentally off mute and said in the middle of part of the practice with Indigenous leaders, "What is this shit?" Across the, but I didn't, those are important signals and feedback because it's a risk. So for me, if I was in that office, part of the key is a willingness to take a risk and a rapid ability to translate it into the spaces, into the ideas that your leadership team has. It doesn't work if there's a Laurel and an Otto and a couple of people who totally get it. Waste of time, right? It has to empower, it has to energize, and it has to raise the confidence levels of our leadership. So it has to be a driver of horizontal leadership. So those are the two things that would need to happen for that office. But I would say maybe even more important than any of that is a willingness to deeply listen,
Mm.
deeply listen. And I think part of what I've learned in this process is that what happens with these kinds of approaches when you start to put them into practice in different aspects of your life is that you know with confidence that although you don't have the answer, you have part of it, and it will not emerge until you connect and co-create together. It won't be there, and then it will be there. It's like that. So coming into those spaces, I realized what was risky is that I had no idea how it would go. I didn't know if anybody would show up. I didn't know if more people would unmute and say, "What is this shit?" You don't know. You don't know. But it's what auto calls action confidence to me. So you don't work it all out. You have it in your head. You make sure it's perfect, and then you do. You do, and then you learn from the doing. That's the key in this space. So that would be a process of listening. That would be embracing the risk of not knowing.
Mm.
And then I think related to that is the perseverance to continue. So that's what I find with a lot of this work. The colleagues that have gone through it, even though there's some better metrics now, there's always this question, what are the metrics? Can you measure density of relationships? Have you improved them? What are you without that, how will you be able to continue this work? But frankly, it doesn't work like that for much of this. You may forget it for a year or two and it comes up in a different way when you're at a different point in your life. But it's that trust. It's that trust that we are in this together. We need to find ourselves again. We need to be whole as best as that's possible if we're going to contribute towards something we also want to be whole or more complete. So to me, that requires it's the opposite of meditation at that point. It's a really active willingness not to give up. I was going to say to fight, but sometimes people don't like. But to me, it's a resilience not to give up, and it's so easy for people to be dismissive of compassionate leadership. I think women leaders see this especially, right, or what you would call a soft skill, quite literally. When this is a hard skill, this is the skill. This is how you transform. But you have to have such a strong network. You have to have such strong sense of confidence because it won't be that you're knocked out, but you will take knocks for leading with this. This is a risky and a bold way to lead. It certainly would be for the UN.
Yes, I hear you. And thanks for describing also how you got colleagues out of their comfort zone with with these new tools that we get through all of these practices, including Theory U, Otto Scharmer, and the transformative spaces. I've also applied them in a couple of my retreats and workshops. And in the beginning, the colleagues were all like, what is happening here? We're sitting in a circle and we're drawing, or we're having one-on-one conversations where we need to listen and all of this. And then afterwards, you can see how much they enjoy it to do something new and to get out of their normal way of mindset. And I would like to hear from you, maybe to inspire more colleagues to embrace that. Do you have any concrete examples of nice new connections that were made or new collaborations that came out of it, or any success that you feel comes from this kind of leadership style that
Yeah,
you can
thanks,
tell
Silke.
us
And
about?
thanks for framing it also in the sense of the leadership style, because I think all of this in the culture that we have across most of the ways we work at the UN, it's better if you can build it into what you're doing. I think as soon as you have to talk about it and explain it and make it a thing, for the moment, you've lost 75% of whomever you were looking to engage with differently. It's quite a different way for us to work. So the more that you can lead with it, the more that you can integrate it into how you invite, how you set the stage, how you set an agenda, how much time you leave for people to connect with each other, etc. Right? The kinds of questions that you pose, who you ask to come in first, these basic things, they help change the discourse. It shifts the outcome without needing to be, kind of a teacher telling other people what one or another theory is all about. So one, I think that that's important. But in terms of successes for out of the process as I've seen them, or for me, it really has been a deeper sense of action confidence than I had before. What I know is that I won't know until I do it. So I can't only live in my head. I can't only make sure I know everything, I've done everything, it's all right, and then I take a move. It won't work that way. I'll have to act first with the best of my knowledge, not in a way that's erratic, but it requires the jump. It requires a leap every time. And the more that you do it, the more that you jump, and kind of hold that space of possibility, the more ways that this comes together. So when I first wanted to do this work with Otto, he knows this story. I sent him an email. I was on maternity leave, early COVID, and he was running something called Gaia, global sense making into the COVID disruption. And he never emailed me back, which he found the email about a year later. But then I called Mardia, who was my assistant secretary general at the time in UNDP in the policy bureau. And he said, oh, I know, Otto, it would be great, but I don't know if I should get involved in this way. And I pushed it, just join the first call, just help me tee up one conversation, right? And I didn't let go of that and took that risk. I guess in retrospect, that's what it is. And from that first call between Mar, Otto, and myself, so then we created a series of dialogues, global dialogues, and so the work moved. And then we created the deep dive, for which we had no basis to do. There was no template to work from, but it made sense at the time. And then we built it into UNDP's People for 2030. It made sense. There was no precedent again to do that. And so when the opportunity came for the UN 2.0 crowd, I reached out to the Secretary General's office and said, what about something like this? So I realized, those things are easier to see looking back. There's tons of, successes and openings and also dead ends that happen when you're trying to lead with something that feels right. You feel that you're confident in the approach, but you don't really know exactly how it will turn out. And we still don't. But I'm more comfortable now taking that leadership because I have not seen anything else that's brought a sense of energy, something that can be sustained, something that's helped people to know each other differently than they might have otherwise, besides these approaches.
Love that. And I wanted to ask you if you have advice for young leaders in the system that might be starting to be a bit disillusioned. How can we motivate them to be a bit more courageous and to follow their intuition and maybe do some of these practices or show up as regenerative leaders in their teams, even if they are not officially senior managers yet?
Completely. So we bring a lot of this over the years. We brought a lot of this training into junior professional officer orientation and so on. And colleagues often ask me that question. It's one thing to say, you've been in this system for a long time, you have a certain post level, which gives you, and you're working in New York, it affords you an ability to take risk. And that's true and that's fair. I really think the key for colleagues that are just starting or coming into the system is to build your skills, not forget why you joined right from the beginning. There's questions that we ask when we do different journaling through a theory you approach to reconnect. Write that letter to your younger self. What would you advise them? Right? Ask yourself, if the UN was a living and breathing entity, what would it say to you now? Right? These kinds of things, these different ways. And I really think for colleagues, especially for colleagues that are entering the system, that level of self-awareness and awareness of the system is the key. I would say that I didn't have that. You do your job, you are told to do things a certain way. Maybe you create a little bit of flexibility, but you're often following the line, right, in the lane in that respect. And so it requires a lot of awareness of the system, awareness that you're in a lane in the first place, and then an ability to create some allies and alliances. You can't do this work on your own. I really believe that. So who are your allies and alliances, and what are ways of bringing this into your professional lives, the way that you lead, that makes sense in the spaces that you're working? That's why I feel for many of these spaces, it's almost better not to have to talk about the why, and identify carefully a few ways that you can lead. For example, one of the things that we started doing during lunches when we had meetings or retreats or anything like that is we put a couple of questions for colleagues to answer just at their lunch tables. And it doesn't sound revolutionary, but still the results surprise us. So the first question was, tell us a little bit about your family. And it wouldn't surprise you, Silke, you've been in the system for a long time, how often we don't really know anything about each other's family. I don't know how many siblings you have, etc. The second one is, tell us about a defining moment. And you define how deep or not deep you want to go on that answer. Share a defining moment. Third question, what's brewing in your life, in your work right now? That's it. 3 questions. And what we found is, even in colleagues who know each other really well, you've worked together for years, you've never actually understood what was a defining moment for them. You didn't know. And it matters to the way that you relate to them now. You didn't understand this whole kind of, it's like going from black and white to a technicolor. You didn't even realize you were looking in black and white, right? So these are ways that things can be brought in, and people see it and feel it for themselves. You don't have to explain that to anybody. They're with you listening, right? Everyone has the opportunity then to connect differently. So I would really encourage younger or newer colleagues into the system, think about things like that, and find your alliances, right? Find those people, because I find the more we've put these ideas or created these spaces, people show up. It's not as lonely as it might appear at the beginning.
Wow, yes, that's beautiful advice. And creating this network, I think, is one of my passions, to really bring all of us in the UN to transform the system from inside, in relating better with each other, collaborating better, and embodying a more life-affirming leadership in general, whatever that means. But I've seen that in you always. When I worked with you, you've always been a leader with heart and compassion, and you have always kept a very relational approach around you, and that was unusual for me to witness, and so inspiring. And my last question for you, and sorry, we're a little over time already, but what can you share as maybe a daily practice that keeps you so grounded and so connected with yourself and the people around you? Do you have anything that we can learn from?
Thanks, okay. Not much in the way of a formal daily practice, actually. But the thing that I try to remember that helps me is that it's not a problem that it's hard. It's not a reason to give up because it's difficult. At this moment, and you and I were talking about this a little bit, Silke, of these dramatic changes in world order. I mean, a real attempt to decimate or denigrate international cooperation, the very notion that we're in this together and that we're stronger together, all of these things, right? And as much as, those things are happening, so the UN needs to move through a complete reform, and that is not pretty. It really isn't. It's disappointing, right? And it would give you every reason to feel a high level of despair. So for me, the key is to say that is true, right? There's no way around these things. And I think for many of your listeners, people are experiencing this, and there's no practice that is immediately going to get you out of that reality. And it's a mistake to imagine that it could. It can't. For me, it does just the opposite. It allows me to do the best I can to find the opportunities within my control and to recognize that there are things that are going to disappoint me dramatically. And it's not a reason. Maybe it's just the opposite. Maybe it's a sign that I'm on the right path. But I think for colleagues that are experiencing so much hardship in so many different aspects of their lives and so many different ways that we experience life in 2025, not to say, I mean, to say then also add the reality of what the UN is going through. That for me is the key, is to be able to say with all of that, with so much sort of like constantly shaken around us, what is the clarity? And to do that, you're tapping into a lot of the skills, a lot of the leadership qualities that we've tried to bring in as sort of an awareness base or a compassionate approach. So that's the key. Accept that it will be difficult. Accept that it will feel monumentally disappointing, and don't go anywhere. Hang in. That's to me sort of the if that's a daily practice, I'm not sure. That's the daily practice for me right now.
Thank you for the pep talk. I think a lot of us need that right now. And also, thank you so much for sharing all this wisdom. It was a truly enlightening conversation. And also, it gives me personally so much hope that there are already these movements within the system, these people that understand we need to lead differently, we need to be differently, we need some kind of system change. And there are tools and solutions, and you talked about them. And if we all follow them, I think there's an opportunity to turn things around altogether. So thank you, Laurel, and all the best for your mission.
Thanks for having me.